Previously, on Catastrophic Failure. The trial of Prestige limo company operator Nauman Hussain got underway in Schoharie in May of 2023.
The evidence will show that Mr. Hussain's choices led directly to and caused the deaths of those 20 people.
Pretending that a single individual caused the death of so many. It's not justice.
It was a trial marked by twists and turns in just the first few days. An unexpected dismissal of 2 jurors left precious few alternates. A whole witness testimony was thrown out on a technicality. Things were not looking good for a seemingly disorganized prosecution up against a defense that had built some serious momentum.
It kind of felt like this was a little over, especially over Ms. Mallory's head at points.
I thought that Lee Kinlan and Nauman would win.
But the trial was only at the halfway point. What was to come in the second half was new and surprising information we'd never heard before about the limo's maintenance history. Nauman Hussain's fate hung in the balance. I'm Jessica Marshall. This is Catastrophic Failure, Episode 10, Justice. If you've been with us thus far, you know that the narrative and the details may be upsetting or disturbing at times, so please listen with care. It was day 8 of the trial, and New York State Department of Transportation investigator Chad Smith had just stepped down from the stand. His testimony had been impactful. Defense attorney Lee Kinlan's heated cross-examination had raised doubt, at least in the minds of many spectators, about the strength of the prosecution's case. Had the DOT really done all it could to keep the 2001 Ford Excursion stretch limousine off the road in the months leading up to the 2018 crash? Did bureaucratic dysfunction contribute directly? Was Nauman Hussain not exclusively at fault here, as the prosecution had contended? Reporter Larry Rulison had been present for every second of testimony thus far. He practically lived at the courthouse during the trial. During breaks, he'd go across the street to a little cafe to write his dailies on the proceedings. Chad Smith dismissed off the stand. The next guy, this was like a back-to-back, bombshell witnesses, right? So the next guy who came up was Virgil Park, who was formerly the store manager at the Mavis Discount Tire in Saratoga. And this, in many ways, is even a bigger bit of testimony than Chad Smith.
Virgil Park is sort of like one of the central witnesses. I mean, the first time we ever heard his name was back in 2019 when Susan Mallory declared that she might have uncovered some evidence that Mavis might have done some illegal stuff here with the limousine, and that I think that's what ultimately led her to try to make a plea deal. So in Virgil Park, it was in a lot of ways, he was the star witness we were all waiting for. But it was unusual because the prosecution he really hurt their case, but they also had to call him up to testify because he's really the only person that really knew the mechanical condition of the limousine.
We have to go back to early 2018 here, more than 6 months before the crash. Sometime between January and April. No one could be sure of the exact date. Virgil Park was the manager of the Mavis Discount Tire in Saratoga Springs. He was working at the shop, and he got a phone call from Nauman Hussein. The Husseins, Nauman, his brother, and their father Shahid, were regular customers. They brought vehicles from their fleet there for service. The limo had been there before multiple times. Park testified that he knew it well. Nauman said over the phone that they needed help with the limo. They'd put transmission fluid into the master cylinder, he said, and didn't know what to do. Remember our little brake system tutorial back in episode 5? When you're driving a car and you need to brake, you push your brake pedal down with your foot. That depresses a plunger that forces fluid into the master cylinder and then out to the calipers, which clamp the brake pads on the wheel rotors and slow the wheel. Now, you can't just pour any old fluid into the master cylinder to refill it. It has to be brake fluid specifically. That's a clear or yellowish fluid that has a high boiling point to stand up to the high heat caused by friction and contains special lubrication to keep things flowing smoothly throughout the system. Brake fluid is very different from transmission fluid. Transmission fluid keeps your vehicle's metal gears from grinding. It's pink or red and contains petroleum. Petroleum is great for lubricating metal, but it's going to destroy rubber. Your vehicle's braking system has rubber seals. I asked a seasoned mechanic recently about what would happen if I put transmission fluid into my master cylinder in place of brake fluid. He just shook his head and said one word: bad. He explained to me that the biggest problem is the petroleum in the transmission fluid. If you put it into your brake system, it's going to cause the seals and other rubber parts of it to swell and deform. And if you don't flush out the transmission fluid immediately and replace it with the correct brake fluid, something you should really have a trained mechanic do, you're going to end up with severe brake failure. Virgil Park testified during Nauman Hussein's trial that he told Nauman on the phone not to drive the limo until he'd gone under the hood and sucked out as much of the transmission fluid as he could from the master cylinder. Use a turkey baster, he said. Then fill it with actual brake fluid and bring it to a mechanic to have the system flushed completely. But act quickly, he cautioned, and do not drive it far.
And that was one of the reasons Virgil Park blamed for the brake problems. And that's true, because transmission fluid can eat into the components, especially the rubber components. And so that was a total shock.
According to Park's testimony, Nauman Hussein brought the limo in for service on April 23rd of 2018. That's a little less than 6 months before the crash. Nauman complained that the rear brake was grinding and that the pedal was low, meaning you had to really push it hard to get any braking action. Because the judge did not allow recording during witness testimony, we had some Times Union staffers reenact this next part of the direct examination between Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory and the witness, Virgil Park.
So when you saw there was metal on the brake pads and the red fluid, what did you and the mechanic decide for repairs?
We would recommend doing a hydraulic fluid flush, replace calipers, all 4, along with the brake hoses.
And did you discuss that with Nauman Hussein?
Yes.
And after discussing with Nauman Hussein, what was required, what was decided to be done?
Do the bare minimum to get it fixed so we can get it back on the road.
Were you under a time pressure?
It seemed that every time he came in, it was a time crunch.
And did he indicate that it had to be in service or anything, that he had a gig coming up?
It was prom season.
When you say the bare minimum, what were you instructed by Nauman to do?
Get it back up so it's got brakes, get brake pads on it, and do whatever we need to do on the one side, and that's it.
Park says when the limo came in, he never saw any out-of-service sticker nor did he see any vice grip on the brake line, which was something that Chad Smith had flagged in the surprise inspection a little more than a month earlier. That was one of the things that spurred him to mark it out of service. So between March 21st, when it was marked out of service, and April 23rd, someone had removed the vice grip. We knew from DNA evidence already that it was Nauman who removed the sticker. Between April 23rd and May 11th, 2018, Virgil Park had ordered a new master cylinder for the limo, but it was never used. Flash forward to May 11th, Nauman Hussein comes back to Mavis to pick up the limo. He's told they replaced the left rear caliper, the brake pads, and the brake hose. It had also passed a New York State DMV inspection. Nauman paid $570.93 for the service, which, by the way, included parts and labor for a phantom master cylinder. The prosecution obtained surveillance footage of the interaction between Virgil Park and Nauman Hussein on that day. They played it in court. A lot of it was inaudible, but they provided a transcript. From what was discernible, Park can be heard telling Nauman, quote, "You know what the problem is. Tranny fluid and brake fluid doesn't mix." Park then jokingly tells Nauman to hit himself in the head, quote, "really hard with a hammer." But in the end, Park tells them they fixed the brakes, for now. But he says he doesn't know if they will hold up without more service in the future. After that, Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory asked Virgil Park about the New York State DMV inspection that the limo had passed during that service. We already knew that Mavis Discount Tire was not authorized to do inspections on the limousine. It was supposed to get an authorized DOT inspection. But what Park said next on the stand was shocking.
He ordered one of his employees to just slap an inspection sticker, passing DMV inspection sticker, on the limo and just literally go into my file cabinet, grab one of those stickers and slap it on the front of the limo. And they didn't even look at any parts to do the inspection, and basically just were able to get it passed on the DMV system somehow without doing the inspection.
Virgil Park admitted that he forced an employee to pass the inspection on May 11th, 2023, without ever even examining the limo. According to testimony, Nauman Hussein brought the limo back to Mavis in Saratoga Springs about a month and a half later, on June 29th, 2018. The brakes were locking up again. Park sent one of his mechanics to look at it. He told Nauman there were still lingering problems because of the transmission fluid mishap earlier in the year. Again, here are some Times Union staffers reenacting this portion of the direct examination.
Did Nauman return to Mavis on or about June 29th, 2018?
Yes.
And did you have a conversation with him regarding what should be done to the limousine?
Yes.
And what did you tell him should be done to the 2001 Ford Excursion stretch limousine?
To fix it correctly, we needed to do all 4 calipers, all 4 hoses, and a master cylinder.
I'm not talking about mechanically repaired. Did you have an opinion as to whether or not it should still be used for service?
I actually told him to burn it.
According to Virgil Park's testimony, Nauman Hussein never returned to Mavis to have the recommended repairs done, which would have cost him an estimated $800 to $1,000. The next time he saw Nauman, he testified, was after the October 6th crash, when he came in to get the limo's service records. Susan Mallory knew that it was a risk bringing Virgil Park to the stand. Evidence that the Mavis employees faked brake work and an inspection without Nauman Hussein's knowledge frankly cast some shadows on the argument that Nauman was exclusively to blame for the crash. Mallory focused her questioning, though, on trying to show that Nauman knew what was wrong with the limo and pressured Mavis to cut corners. Of course, when it was time for defense attorney Lee Kinlan to cross-examine Virgil Park, he didn't hold back. Blaming Mavis Discount Tire for the crash was the heart of Nauman's defense. And Virgil Park's testimony, even before cross-examination, was making Mavis look, as the kids say today, kinda sus.
He wasn't a great witness at all. You didn't think he was lying, but he just seemed to say all the time that he had no clue what his job responsibilities were. And Lee Kinlan would constantly ask him, well, did you know you're not allowed to inspect stretch limousines and that you're supposed to tell the owners of any stretch limousines that come to your shop that you're supposed to direct them to the Department of Transportation? He kept saying no, even though he'd been in the industry for a long time and supposedly had all this training. He was a very frustrating witness and very squirrely. He sort of didn't get any resolution with his testimony either on a lot of things.
After Kinlan's cross-examination, Susan Mallory got up for redirect. In a nutshell, she asked Park if replacing the master cylinder would have made a difference in the limo's braking performance on the day of the crash. Park said no. Replacing the cylinder would not have made a difference. Kinlan got up for recross and got Virgil Park to admit that he did not know that the master cylinder had not been replaced. He said an employee never told him. That employee, his name is Chikezi Okoro, and he was next up on the stand. Okoro had been assigned to work on the limousine when Nauman Hussein brought it in on April 23rd of 2018.
Okoro had filmed himself doing work on the excursion and showing how they couldn't even get it on the lift because the lift wasn't designed for a vehicle that big, and he was like jerry-rigging the thing to stay up and get under it, and he was filming it, and they showed video from his phone where he was showing how he had to like angle under the limo in a weird angle just to get to work on it.
Once Okoro got it up high enough, he testified, he was able to remove the left rear wheel. He could then see that a red fluid had badly saturated the left rear wheel and caliper. The red color was a telltale sign that was transmission fluid. He replaced the brake pad, the caliper, and the brake line attached to that caliper, and then he said he bled the system. Whenever you replace a caliper, you introduce air into the braking system. Okoro explained that on the stand. Any air will compromise braking ability, so the standard procedure is to bleed the system. That means putting brake fluid into the master cylinder and letting it, quote, bleed out through the entire system until there are no visible air bubbles left. It takes a long time. But that's a very different procedure than flushing the brakes. A flush involves a pump that forces new brake fluid through the system until all traces of the old brake fluid are completely flushed out. As any good mechanic will tell you, if there's evidence of transmission fluid in a brake system, a flush is the only cure. That is, if the transmission fluid hasn't already damaged the rubber seals. Then everything needs to be replaced. But Chikezi Okoro testified that he did not do a flush or replace the master cylinder. Why? He couldn't really say on the stand. He only said he did not, quote, determine that it was necessary. He said he was only instructed to look at the brakes, and he said they worked after replacing the caliper, pads, and hose, and bleeding the system. Next up on the stand was Thomas Corey Klingman, another mechanic who worked at the Saratoga Springs Mavis shop. He is the mechanic who performed the New York State Department of Motor Vehicles inspection on the limo. The one that his former boss, Virgil Park, testified earlier that day had said wasn't actually done. Under direct examination by Susan Mallory, Klingman told a slightly different version of that story. He says he told Virgil Park and another one of his supervisors multiple times that he did not want to work on that limousine. He said he didn't think that the shop should work on it at all. But, he said, he was manipulated into doing the New York State inspection on the limo in May of 2018. His job was on the line. Every mechanic licensed to perform DMV inspections is issued an identification card. Every DMV licensed shop has a special computer on site that is used to perform these inspections. To begin an inspection, a mechanic must scan their ID card and then enter the vehicle's VIN. Once both are cleared for takeoff, the mechanic can begin the inspection. Klingman testified that he refused to use his own card to do the inspection. His boss, Virgil Park, gave him his own card to do it under his name instead. Once again, here are Times Union staffers reenacting part of Klingman's cross-examination by defense attorney Lee Kinlan.
You, as a New York State inspector working for Mavis on May 11, 2018, said that you had inspected the vehicle, correct?
I did not inspect the limousine.
We'll get to that in a minute, but you used your boss's card to enter an inspection into the NYS VIP system, correct?
Yes.
At Virgil's direction, you did this?
Yes.
Because you didn't want to use your own card?
Correct.
You did not perform any safety inspection on this vehicle, correct?
Correct.
All brake lines and hoses, check for leaks, cracks, chafing, restrictions, and improper support. Did you check for any of those?
No.
In fact, when you went through the NYS VIP computer system, you just went down and hit P after every entry, correct?
Correct.
You even hit P for something called a thermostatic air cleaner, correct?
Yes.
They haven't equipped vehicles with thermostatic air cleaners since the 1990s, correct?
I see you're trying to get to me.
I'm just asking a question, sir.
I did go through the system and passed everything on it.
Without checking anything?
Yes.
Did Virgil know you did this?
Yes.
You told Virgil that you passed the vehicle, even though you didn't check anything?
I didn't tell Virgil anything. He told me to use his card to put a sticker in the window of the limousine.
And you took that to mean hit pass on everything?
Of course, he's my boss. I'm not looking to get fired.
These two mechanics, they're maybe a few years out of community college. They're young. And they were the only two that worked at the shop on the cars that came in. And so Virgil Park's their boss, and you can tell they did not like working. Klingman especially hated working on the limo when it came in, because I think he knew it was a lost cause and he just wanted no part of it.
At some point after the investigation into the crash began, Virgil Park was fired from Mavis Discount Tire. Okoro and Klingman also no longer work there, though it's not clear why. Next up on the stand were New York State Trooper David Roy and DOT Transportation Specialist Martin Duffy. Trooper Roy had pulled the limo over in August of 2018 and called Duffy to do a roadside inspection. There was nothing in either of their testimonies that we hadn't already reported. That was the roadside stop when limo driver Scott Lissanikia was ordered off the road for not having proper qualifications to drive a limo of that size with that many passengers. After them was Donald Cottrell, who's the garage supervisor at Advantage Transit Group. That's the company that owned the limo prior to the Husseins. Cottrell testified that he spoke directly to Nauman and his brother about the DOT regulations, right? He said, I talked adamantly about doing it the right way, not to play around with the DOT.
Yeah.
So that was proof that they had been told you're going to need to do this more rigorous DOT stuff. Otherwise, you're going to get in trouble, right?
I had spoken to the owner of that company before that too, and he confirmed that, they said, hey, don't mess around, get this thing DOT inspected, do the right thing, get operating authority. You guys got a lot of work to do to get that thing roadworthy. They were very clear about that.
The next noteworthy witness came later that day. We were now on day 9 of the trial. The next witness is someone that we haven't really talked about at all on the podcast, and someone that we've actually never been able to speak to for various reasons, but they put the driver's wife, Kim Lisanikia, up on the stand. What was notable about her testimony?
It was very interesting. She had said that she usually would go with Scott on some of his assignments, and I think she said she didn't go that morning because she was too tired. Her main testimony was that that her husband was a very good driver and that he was very conscientious, and she never saw him drive recklessly. And I think that both sides, they didn't really push her at all on much, considering that her husband had died in the crash, and I didn't think they wanted to put her through too much misery on the stand.
The next 2 witnesses were individuals who'd seen the limo on the road in Schoharie minutes before it crashed. They testified that the limo smelled strongly of burning brakes and that it appeared to be laboring as it moved down the road and made very loud noises. As an interesting side note, one of these witnesses, a local farmer, was the reason many potential jurors had been disqualified. He was so well known in the county. Holly Wood was called to the stand next. We spoke to her back in episode 1. She was at the stop sign at the corner of routes 30 and 30A when the limo came barreling down the hill at 100 miles per hour. She watched it fly by her and then crash. Holly told us afterward that it had been hard for her to speak about what she saw that day for many years. But she knew she was an important witness for the prosecution. She believed, as they did, that Nauman Hussein was responsible for the crash.
To tell you the God's honest truth, I was so scared and nervous and upset that it was a blur to me. It really was. I mean, I just kept wanting to look at him in anger because I don't know if he really ever really heard my side of the story and what he put us through, and then I was just like, I know he knows what he did to the families, but I have to live this. I have to live this the rest of my life. My daughter has to live it the rest of her life. And it's not something that, we can just easily get over, I mean, and I know the families can't either. But it's just like, they didn't live it. Like they lived the after effects of it. We went through the whole thing plus the after effects, and it's like, and I don't expect anybody to feel sorry for me. I don't expect any sympathy for it or anything like that. I just wanted him to pay. He was negligent. He really was.
The next witness was Jacqueline Schnur. Her husband, Brian Huff, and father, James Schnur, were the 2 bystanders killed when the limo crashed into their Toyota Highlander in the parking lot of the Apple Barrel Country Store before it crashed into the embankment.
Her testimony was the most, I felt like it was the most impactful of the trial and the most vivid and powerful. I can't describe it any other way because she was explaining how, she was there with her husband, their kid, her father, and family. They're all in town for a wedding. When she's standing there with her family, like standing around their car, we'd never heard before, sort of first person, where they were in the parking lot or anything. They'd always been described as just pedestrian bystanders. Yeah, her husband and her dad were on the other side of the car, and they were sort of resting there waiting for their lunch. Then she heard the limo come down the hill all of a sudden. Then the next thing she knows, she opens her eyes and the car's gone, her husband's gone, and her father is gone. I always thought it was like Thanos in some Marvel movie where he just snaps his fingers and like everything's gone. And the way she described it was like that. It was just, she doesn't know how she didn't die too, basically.
Defense attorney Lee Kindlin seemed to keep a respectful distance from these witnesses. When given the chance to cross-examine Jacqueline Schnurr, he declined, saying only, quote, "Sorry for your loss." His client, Nauman Hussein, remained stone-faced throughout, with his head down. After Jacqueline Schnurr came Dan Bogan. We heard his powerful account of witnessing the crash in episode 1. We talked to him a few months after the trial concluded.
Immediately after the accident, I didn't have a full perspective of everything, but I just thought, oh my goodness, I'm the only one that really saw this. That's not true. And there's a lot of other people that saw the limo on the way down the hill and through the route. There were other people that were present and saw the accident, but I just immediately thought, I'm the only one that saw this and I'm going to have to testify. And ever since then, I just kind of expected that I would have to. And then as we got closer to the actual trial, I realized I'm really not a central figure in this whole testimony by any means. But I guess I'm relieved to be able to at least have that moment and say it out loud.
We'll be right back.
Why is healthcare so expensive? What's happening with climate change? And are elections safe? You can find answers to those questions and a lot more with Capitol Confidential from me, Dan Clark. I give you the latest news and analysis from the state capitol and beyond. Sign up now at CapitolConfidential.com. That's Capital with an O, confidential.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Catastrophic Failure. The prosecution next called a few of the state police investigators who responded to the scene of the crash or who took part in the criminal investigation. None of their testimony was anything that Larry Rulison hadn't already reported. At one point, though, Judge Peter Lynch had to step in to stop a witness from describing the victims in graphic detail. The last major witness that Larry in particular had been waiting to hear from was Brian Chase. He's the vehicle forensics expert hired by the DA. He was the only investigator to have direct and unfettered access to the limo wreckage to determine a cause. And he blamed catastrophic brake failure in a report he released in 2019.
He was really helpful because having him explain it in like English in the courtroom, I didn't understand the report. He explained how fast the vehicle was going and the amount of kinetic energy. I mean, he came off sort of like a college professor.
He gave out some like numbers, right? Like 2.1 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy, 3.3 million, like just staggering numbers.
Yep.
Really like puts into perspective how horrible this whole thing was. While Lee Kindlin had been relatively quiet through the testimony of the crash witnesses, he was back in the game to cross-examine Brian Chase. He was going heavy on the Mavis thing, and he asked him, he's like, well, did anything that Mavis do or not do cause this accident? And Chase said that no, it wasn't Mavis or the master cylinder.
Yeah, Chase said that he thought the master cylinder honestly looked new to him. And so he sort of said, that looked new to me and it was working. He also just said, the real problem was the steel rear brake line that had a kink and wear on it, and that ultimately burst to cause the devastating brake failure. That really seemed to helped the prosecution a lot, his testimony.
This was a point in the trial that juror Andrea Austin remembers clearly. She remembers clearly being confused, that is.
The manager from Mavis had mentioned the cylinder was not replaced in his testimony. But then the expert witness, Mr. Chase, I believe was his name, he mentioned that at some point the brake cylinder had been replaced. And I would have been very curious to have known, would there have been a way to determine when that master brake cylinder was replaced? Could that have had some impact on the crash and on what the findings were? Is that something where that could have been replaced and the manager didn't know about it? There were a lot of questions in my head about that. And it just kind of felt like it never was followed up on.
But Austin and her fellow jurors were about to have Nauman Hussein's fate in their hands. After Chase's testimony and the brief testimony of another state trooper, the prosecution rested its case. Defense attorney Lee Kindlon did not call any witnesses. Nauman Hussein would not take the stand in his own defense. It was time for closing arguments. The judge allowed the media to record. Defense attorney Lee Kindlon went first.
Look, Nauman, he didn't follow every rule and regulation. I can't stand up here and say anything otherwise. I know that this is the crux of the people's argument. I know that they're going to say that he had a stack of violation notices and fines and stuff.
Kindlon said basically, Nauman Hussein's father, Shahid, dumped this company on him and then left the country. And Nauman wasn't good at running it. He didn't know what he was doing, and Mavis took advantage of him. You're blaming Nauman, he said in so many words, for Mavis's crime.
It's an attempt to bring order to chaos, to find and assign blame so that the community can accomplish some sort of closure. But with all that's been uncovered in this courtroom over the past week, I think we all know that the words "not guilty" are the only way to move us all closer to what really happened.
Frederick Wrench delivered the prosecution's closing argument. There were no surprises there. He stuck to their core narrative, that Nauman Hussein had known the limo was a danger and put it on the road anyway.
The duty to properly maintain the Ford Excursion stretch limousine was Mr. Hussein's duty, exclusively his duty. This was not the duty of Mavis nor any other individual or entity. It was the duty of Nauman Hussein.
And then, in the afternoon on day 12 of the trial, deliberations began.
Because right when we started jury deliberation, I suggested we all just take a couple of minutes and talk about our thoughts on the case to that point, talk about how our impressions lay.
Andrea Austin talked to us about 6 months after the trial concluded.
There were some points where there was just kind of a pause. We would have those moments where you would just kind of pause and you would just be absorbing what was going on in that moment, what we had just been talking about. And then we just moved on to the next thing.
Jury deliberations continued into the next morning. It was now May 17th, 2023, the 13th day of the trial. The jury submitted a question to the judge midway through the morning that got everybody thinking the verdict was near, but they had just asked if he could explain the difference between the two charges that Nauman Hussein was facing: second-degree manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide. The difference is a very important distinction. It could mean a sentence of 5 to 15 years or a sentence of 1 1/3 to 4 years in prison. To prove the higher manslaughter charge, the prosecution had to show that Nauman Hussein specifically knew he was putting an unsafe vehicle on the road.
One of the nice things the bailiffs did was they brought us a square chalkboard that we were able to write up things on. So I would write up, manslaughter. I wrote up a few things like manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide, and some of the big points of each. And then we were able to discuss it a little bit more. And then I think by just after lunch, we were pretty well decided.
Well, at this point, I thought he had a good chance of going free because I can't tell if they proved it well.
And the reason for that was primarily the Mavis stuff, right?
Yeah.
I was not in Schoharie that day. I wasn't even in the country. I was halfway around the world on a vacation. When I left earlier that week, it seemed like the trial would continue until I got back. But I got an alert on my phone. A verdict had been reached. Part of me wanted to hop on the first flight back to the US, but I knew Larry's got this covered. At 2:18 p.m., the jury announced that they'd reached a verdict. Larry Rulison rushed to the courtroom from the cafe across the street where he was working. Judge Lynch emerged from his chambers, his expression impossible to read.
The second he comes in the room, you're just like, oh my God, what is going to happen here? I just was feeling almost like overwhelmed. Like, how do I even report this? My emotions are going to take over here.
Many of the families of the limo victims were in the courtroom, waiting with the same bated breath.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe you hope for the best and you plan for the worst. But I did believe in my heart of hearts that we were going to get that sentence.
Okay, I have received a note from you that marked as court exhibit number 7, and it reads, we have a verdict. If the foreperson would please stand, the clerk of the court will take the verdict from you.
Do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
With respect to the crime of manslaughter in the second degree, in violation of section 125.6.
The jury had convicted Nauman Hussein on 20 counts of the higher charge, second-degree manslaughter.
Nauman's fiancée, Melissa Bell, just started shaking uncontrollably, crying, and honestly, the families, a lot of the mothers gave her tissues, and they didn't, console her, but they were definitely aware that was painful. But then, there was people shouting from the gallery, exultations, and the amount of relief for the families. For them, it was a moment they really needed, but also just sort of, there was some shock too, I think, from the audience, because it's stunning.
There were days when I thought that boy was going to walk.
That's Jill Richardson Perez, who lost her son Matthew. She was in the courtroom when the verdict was announced.
And I will tell you, when they read, I can't think of the word, when they read the verdict, I wanted to scream. I know we had one of the family members yell out, and I will forever when I hear the term "he's going down," I will forever think of that moment in the courtroom and smirk, because that was amazing. You know, we're trying to compose ourselves and be respectful.
That was a moment.
Oh my God, that was a moment.
Mary and Kyle Ashton, who lost their son Michael, were also in the courtroom.
We were both, as far as I could tell, we were both very stoic.
Stoic?
Yeah, stoic, that's the word. We watched the video afterward and saw ourselves, and we were both just kind of sitting there, just very, I can't even describe the feeling. I could not see how Hussein was going to get away with nothing. I couldn't, but I didn't know what to expect. And when that first guilty verdict came through, it was like, oh, thank God.
Donna Rivenberg was homesick that day, but she was watching on television.
I fell asleep in my recliner because I hadn't slept all night. I woke up in my recliner at 2 o'clock, and the breaking news came on. Verdict in the Schoharie limo crash.
Oh my gosh.
I had just woken up, so I heard it with everybody else in the courtroom. And I'm by myself, and I'm screaming, and I'm crying, and when I first heard the first guilty after Savannah's name, it was like unbelievable.
Dan Bogan was at work when the verdict came in.
I was in a Zoom meeting of all things and received a text halfway through that he was found guilty. For the rest of the meeting, I was struggling to stay focused.
I can imagine.
Especially on Zoom, right?
Yeah, what was Nauman's reaction?
I didn't see much. I mean, I guess I wasn't in front of him. I was sort of behind him, but it was as if he wasn't really reacting too much. I know Lee was really consoling him.
He stands convicted of manslaughter in the second degree. His release status is revoked, and I am remanding him to the custody of the Schoharie County Sheriff. He's going now.
I'd never seen anything like it. It was like watching a public execution. I just never seen anyone like lose their freedom, like on the spot. He probably wasn't ready for it.
That's powerful. God, I'm so pissed I missed it. Times Union photographer Jim Franco was in the courtroom that day and caught Nauman Hussein's reaction head on. Hussein appeared to be crying and covered his eyes as his attorney consoled him after the verdict was read. But by the time he was handcuffed and escorted out of the courtroom, his face once again became emotionless. His sentencing would come in 2 weeks' time. He was facing 5 to 15 years in prison. Outside the courtroom, Janet Steenberg, who lost her sons Rich and Axel, spoke to a massive gaggle of reporters.
I don't know, it's kind of a relief, you know, I mean, I feel bad. I felt bad for his girlfriend. I know that's wrong, or well, not really wrong, but I felt bad for her, which she broke down and cried, and I'm thinking, I'm crying for her because I'm happy, and, you know, but there is no real happy ending, I guess, right?
Mary Ashton also spoke. She says she was thrilled about the verdict, but she said she still didn't think justice was completely done.
Why haven't they been indicted? That's my question. Where's Mavis in all of this?
That week, the district attorney in Saratoga County, where the Mavis Discount Tire Shop is, said she was investigating Mavis's role in the crash. She said she'd asked state police to provide information from their investigation. But all eyes were on the Schoharie County District Attorney at that moment as she emerged from the courthouse. Susan Mallory stopped to talk to reporters. Her remarks, as always, were brief.
I want to thank the jury for doing an amazing job and listening to the evidence. And today is really about the families. And we just want to make sure that you guys spend time with the families because it's really about their day today.
Hi, everybody.
Defense attorney Lee Kindlon emerged as well. He was not so happy, obviously.
I'm heartbroken. Over the course of the past 4.5 years, I've developed a relationship, either a close personal relationship with my client and his family, his extended family overseas. But I've also existed in an outer layer with all the victims' families. And I really, now at the end of this chapter of the case, I'm just heartbroken for everybody involved.
Reporters asked Kindlon about the Saratoga DA looking into Mavis Discount Tire's potential criminal liability. It was at the core of his defense, after all.
It's always difficult to find a silver lining on a gray cloud of having my client convicted, but if we were able in any way to help move that discussion forward, certainly Nauman is happy about that,
Kindlon said he'd called Nauman's father, Shahid, to tell him of the verdict. Kindlon says Shahid just sobbed. He also confirmed that Nauman Hussein planned to appeal immediately.
How are you feeling after everything?
Relieved.
Yeah.
It's nice to be out in the sun after 2 weeks.
Juror Andrea Austin also came out to speak with the media and with the families of the victims.
It was a very difficult, very heavy trial. We all felt the weight of it on our shoulders as we were doing our deliberations. We knew the gravity of the case and of what we were facing.
6 months later, Larry and I asked her how she felt about the jury's decision. Did she still think it was the right decision?
My thinking was, if it were simply Nauman Hussein versus Mavis, putting aside any other testimony, any other evidence, it was Nauman Hussein versus Mavis, and it was shown that Mavis was negligent, I would have found more for Nauman. But in light of a lot of the other testimony that came into play, that was a lot of what swayed me away from him, was the emails from Chad Smith, the inspections that he and Officer and Mr. Duffy did, the out of service stickers that were placed on and were removed. There were patterns and there were chains of information where they were trying to get this limo taken care of. They were trying desperately to get these inspections done, to get this above board. And if Nauman Hussein had done all of that, Mavis did him dirty and the crash happened because of that link, but everything else was above board, I would not have found him guilty. But in light of the other evidence that was brought into it, it established a pattern that I couldn't sit there and ignore it.
While the limo families were happy about the verdict, there were still open civil lawsuits against the Husseins and against Mavis Discount Tire. And there was the possibility that Mavis could be held criminally liable in Saratoga County, so their fight for justice was not over.
We knew that we wanted to change limousine laws. And I was loud, and the other parents were loud. And they knew we were not going to go away.
Next time on Catastrophic Failure.
With respect to the conviction under count 1 for manslaughter in the 2nd degree,
Nauman Hussein receives his sentence.
That's all I wanted, for him to say he's sorry, take accountability for it. He has never, in all this time, ever said he was sorry. You killed 20 people.
There's one thing Nauman can definitely count on in prison. The limo families look forward to visiting you, wherever you might be in prison. And by that I mean we won't miss a single parole hearing wherever that hearing may take place.
Catastrophic Failure is a production of the Times Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall. Original reporting by Larry Rulison. Editorial direction and fact-checking by Erica Smith and Casey Seiler. Our theme music is Undercurrent by Harper Ray. Special thanks to H. Rose Schneider for help in reporting, and to Akeem Norder, Bill Douglas, David Johnson, and Patrick Tyne for lending their voices.